It's Monday, it's 9:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Labour peer Helena Kennedy, Guardian columnist Raphael Behr and Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Today we'll hear from the new Health Secretary. Does Sajid Javid's appointment mean a change in approach to COVID?
We are still in a pandemic and I want to see that come to an end as soon as possible.
Matt Hancock's gone. The questions continue.
If anybody thinks that the resignation of Matt Hancock is the end of the issue, I think they're wrong.
But will there be big questions for Kier Starmer after this week's by-election in Batley and Spen? And how long can we carry on sending bubbles home from school? Well, let's start with the appointment of the new Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, who said he wants to return to normal as soon as possible. Will it actually lead to a change in policy? Here's the Daily Telegraph headline: Javid to push for swift easing of restrictions. And in the Sun newspaper, they have this headline: Javigo hero Sajid Javid vows to unlock Britain as soon as possible as he takes over COVID response. Camilla, you've written inside the Daily Telegraph. You say he is more hawkish, or will be, in terms of behaviour towards the coronavirus restrictions. What do you think it will mean in reality?
I wish we'd come up with a headline, Javigo hero. That's brilliant. Well, I think really that he is on the lockdown sceptic side of thinking. And there's this sense as well with his Treasury hat on that he's probably reluctant to sort of support Rishi Sunak in any further spending on furlough beyond September. And equally, there's this sense that I think he wants to restore normal. That's why he said that in his statement yesterday. So have we now witnessed, because Matt Hancock, who was very, very dovish, very pro-lockdown throughout, now he's left, is Javid now going to tip the cabinet balance back in favour of being more hawkish about it, which probably would be in line with the thinking of most Tory backbenchers, let alone, as we now know, following the Cummings revelations, the Prime Minister himself.
Raphael, what do you think?
Well, I think the important context here is that whether or not Matt Hancock has resigned, I mean, he's gone, but the context of that situation meant that really the government's authority to tell people what to do, I think, was pretty badly damaged by that whole episode. And so the idea that, you know, even with a new health secretary, the Prime Minister has the authority to start telling people what they should and shouldn't do in their private life with regard to the COVID restrictions has probably been corroded. That said, you do also have this situation where, in theory, the government is committed to follow the data, and no matter how much I agree the Conservative Party is desperate to get these the restrictions out of the way, and I agree that Sajid Javid will probably come at this looking at it with his Treasury hat on and want to just get the economy moving as briskly as possible. But the fact is, this Delta variant does really appear to be ripping through those bits of the society that aren't vaccinated, and so the idea that you can just dictate, say, this date, we're just going to do it, we're going to go for it, without regard to what the numbers are doing, might, in a couple of weeks' time, look rash.
Right, well, Bim, we know Sajid Javid is going to be making a statement later on today, updating on some of the data and around the coronavirus restrictions. There had been some talk of lifting them earlier than July the 19th. That looks unlikely to happen, but would you like it to happen on July the 5th, like some of your Conservative colleagues?
I'd like it to happen as quickly as possible, but we need to be sensible and cautious about it. I think the 19th of July was set as the expected time when this would happen, and I think that's still correct. The broader point that Raphael makes is a very important one, but the key aspect, though, is about, you said, following the numbers or following the data. It's which numbers, which data. The key thing is people getting seriously ill or ending up in hospital. What appears to be happening a lot, when you bear in mind the rise in cases, is that the link between cases and hospitalisations has broken down to a large extent. And I think that that is the key aspect to this, because once you have vaccinated the vulnerable, we have to make steps to move back to normal and to live with the disease.
Right. Do you think Sajid Javid will approach it differently?
I think he has signalled in his first initial statements. I know Sajid well. He's a very careful, experienced politician. His first statements, I think, would have given a signal as to how he wants to approach things. And I think he will want things to get back to normal as soon as possible.
OK. Helena, do you welcome his appointment as the new Health Secretary?
Well, I think someone had to take the job. I think it would have been better if it had been someone. I think that Jeremy Hunt might have been much more knowledgeable. It would have been better to put someone in at this moment who had some real experience in health. But I think Javid is a very experienced person, and we wait and watch.
All right. Well, obviously this all happened because of the resignation of Matt Hancock, all rather dramatic, over the weekend. There's the front page of the Sun newspaper. He resigned after footage of him appeared kissing his aide. Bim, why did the Prime Minister initially say it was right for Matt Hancock to stay and then say it was right for him to resign?
Well, I think this was a personal issue, obviously, that relates to his relationship with this lady and indeed his family. And I think the Prime Minister was reluctant to force someone to resign over what was predominantly a personal issue. Now, of course, the Prime Minister and all of us recognise the wider policy implications of breaking the COVID rules at that time. But the Prime Minister, I think, just looked at this and thought, look, this is a very personal issue, and was reluctant to force someone to resign because of it. But then once things developed over the next, 12, 24 hours, and it became apparent that this was very much being seen, not just in Parliament but outside, as almost not so much a personal issue but more an issue as the COVID restrictions. I think the Prime Minister then recognised, as Matt Hancock did, as did the rest of us, that the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, had to go. Right,
well, why didn't you and the Prime Minister recognise that immediately, the rank hypocrisy that so many people talked about in terms of Matt Hancock's behaviour and breaking the COVID rules?
Well, as I say, it's because when these things happen, I know politicians live in the spotlight, but it is primarily a personal issue, and I think that all of us, most of us, tend to be reluctant to get into those things when it comes to this sort of thing. But as I say, it is clear that the overwhelming response from within the party and the public is that Matt Hancock no longer had authority as Health Secretary and therefore would have to go.
All right, well, let's hear how the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, saw it.
He resigned because he considered the matter carefully. He could see that the issue of credibility was one that was really majoring. And as somebody who is a key spokesman in all of this with regard to health regulations and the fight against COVID, he realised he could no longer carry that with conviction and credibility.
So, Bim, it was more about Matt Hancock's loss of credibility rather than he'd done anything wrong?
Well, I made the point that he had to be credible in terms of the COVID restrictions, but of course he accepted he did something wrong. Of course he did.
Right. Were you one of? Well, clearly you weren't actually one of scores of Tory MPs who did say his position was untenable right from the get-go.
Well, I hadn't spoken to the Chief Whip, as some of my colleagues may have done, in that first few hours, but personally I thought that it was likely that over the weekend he was going to have to resign, and he did. Right,
well, let me bring up the issue, actually, that Raphael pointed to at the beginning of the programme, which is about people's trust in government and people's trust in how they should behave, being told what to do in terms of restrictions, just like Dominic Cummings over his trip to Barnard Castle. Can you understand your constituents saying to you, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to take these rules seriously anymore?
Not just my constituents, MPs. Members of my own family, lots of people over the last couple of days have been so angry with what happened, and I think they're right to be, and that's why the Health Secretary had to go.
Right. I mean, Boris Johnson said in his letter accepting the resignation from Matt Hancock, he said, I don't believe your contribution to public service is over. Do you think Matt Hancock can make a return to high office?
Well, first of all, he is a Member of Parliament and will remain so, and that is contribution to public office as well. And in the future, who knows what happens? I mean, people sometimes come back, sometimes they don't. I think it's far too early for that. At the moment, what we're doing is focusing on getting to the next phase of this so that by the 19th of July, hopefully, we can be living with, overall, very few, if any, restrictions on our lives.
In the end, Matt Hancock resigned, yes, a few days after that footage was released. Helena, is that enough in terms of drawing a line under his role?
No, it's not, because there are so many other things now that are going to have to be looked at, not least how it comes about that your mistress ended up getting a job with the Department of Health, where she would have been part of the oversight of the Secretary of State. I mean, there is something really appalling about that. But I want to just pick up on the business about our Prime Minister, because his response was a very classic Boris response, which was, of course, he himself has a track record when it comes to the personal. So, of course, he saw it as being about sexual morality, and he was, definitely going to stand by his man. But in fact, didn't step back and think, I want all of the facts. I want to see the full picture here before I make a decision. He rashly made an immediate decision, which, of course, he had to be backtracking on. And people had to then point out how this was much more significant, that it was about integrity and decency and about any number of other things, but probity, as the Lord Chancellor said, about whether you can now trust someone's word on things. He could not have gone into the House today and answered questions about what are the next steps without being laughed at. He was risible. And I'm afraid that had been building up over many months of distrust of this Home Secretary.
Right.
So, of this Home Secretary, sorry, forget the Home Secretary goes into the same category.
Let's stick with the Health Secretary, or the outgoing Health Secretary.
Yeah, the Health Secretary for a moment. But I mean, the Health Secretary had been getting a lot of things wrong. And there are questions also about the whole cronyism thing, because Matt Hancock was up to his eyes in that. And of course, we now know that, contracts have gone to people like his mistress's brother and so on. I'm sure it's fine.
All right.
But we want to know, is it fine?
OK. I mean, Camilla, Helena makes the point about Boris Johnson's judgment. Do you agree there is a question of that again in terms of the way she's outlined it and his response to Matt Hancock?
Well, he's got this problem that he can't fire anyone. Even at City Hall, I think his turnover of staff in the first year was enormous, and people were resigning left, right and centre. There is this sense, even when we had the clamour around Dominic Cummings last year, that he simply couldn't put his foot down and fire him, which of course came back to bite him. We've had the same situation with Hancock. He wouldn't fire him during the whole Cummings allegations because he didn't want to look as if Cummings would have his way. Then we obviously had this extraordinary photograph and video on Friday, and I would have thought by Saturday anybody with half a brain would have thought it was a good idea to encourage the Health Secretary to immediately step down rather than sit on it for 24 hours, which only enraged the electorate. But the thing about Johnson is, he has this difficulty in that he wants to be liked and he wants to do the right thing by people. On one hand, you might regard that as honourable. On the other, you might regard it as a weakness in his leadership.
Raphael, how do you see it?
Well, I think certainly Boris Johnson will have come at this partly as a former journalist, as thinking I don't want to surrender to a kind of a media scrum. It would be a sign of weakness if I surrendered my health secretary to other journalists, without necessarily comprehending actually the wider public context of it. Also, I think he quite likes a weak cabinet. He likes he absolutely demands loyalty where he can get it. If he got into the business of saying, look, the criterion for serving in my cabinet is you have to have integrity, probity, you've got to be serious, professional across your brief, well, then pretty quickly people would start thinking, well, hang on, Prime Minister, does any of that apply to you? And he probably deep down knows that it doesn't. So he'd much rather have sort of weak and subservient ministers than serious, competent ones who could actually possibly even sort of start showing him up a little bit. And ultimately, it's very revealing also, I think, that he does a reshuffle that isn't a reshuffle at all. He finds someone who he can bring in from the backbenchers, to whom he basically promised the job, saying, yes, you can come back one day, Sajid. So he brings Sajid Javid back, doesn't have to do a reshuffle, doesn't have to go through all the awkward diplomacy of disappointing other ministers, telling other ministers they're fired, getting rid of Gavin Williamson, although everyone in the Conservative Party and beyond knows he shouldn't be the Education Secretary anymore. He's just kind of kicking the can down the road. He doesn't want trouble. And that is, I think, as Camilla said, really an expression of his character as a Prime Minister. And he gets away with it for the time being until one day he doesn't. Right.
Is that what it's about, Bim? His character as Prime Minister? He just can't sack anyone and has weak cabinet ministers around him.
Well, I think at the moment, the Prime Minister is aware, as all of us are, that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so it may well have been a very good judgment of his not to necessarily have a full-blown reshuffle in the middle of this pandemic, because I think if I was on this programme, you would have said, why is he having a reshuffle at this very, very serious time? You could look at it the other way. So I think that having an experienced cabinet ministers like Sajid Javid to come in is the right solution at this time. But the broader point that Raphael makes, I think, is wrong. I think it's clear to see when you look at ministers, I mean, you mentioned the Chancellor, you can talk of the Northern Ireland Secretary, you can talk of the Foreign Secretary, various ministers who Raphael didn't mention, but who are highly able, well-respected domestically and internationally. It is not true at all that the Prime Minister doesn't want his ministers to be as able as possible. Of course he does. And the time when it comes right for a reshuffle is when he'll do that. But that is probably not in the middle of the pandemic as we're trying to get to the 19th of July.
But does he have a problem with sacking ministers? You heard what Raphael said there. I referred to Dominic Cummings, who wasn't obviously a cabinet minister, but also Gavin Williamson and then Matt Hancock. He accepted that he could stay for 48 hours.
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been sacked by him, but what I am having to be sacked from. But I think that it's probably fair to say the Prime Minister doesn't like surrendering to a media mob that may whip up over any particular issue at any particular time. I don't regard that as a bad thing. I regard that as a good thing. He likes to make his decisions around who should be in post and then likes to stick it out for as long as possible. I think that's a good quality rather than just surrendering to the Blair-like, sort of surrendering to the media mob at every given opportunity.
It could be that he doesn't have a very a good grip on what integrity looks like.
Bim?
I don't think that's fair, Baroness Kennedy.
Right. Do you think he's in a difficult position, though, when it comes to those sorts of issues and being able to take decisions like getting rid of ministers like Matt Hancock?
No, because the Prime Minister will make decisions on the basis of who he thinks can do a good job, but also, and this is important, also the wider circumstances that you're in, such as being in a pandemic or indeed in an economic crisis or anything else that may appear. So I think that the Prime Minister has to consider all of those things.
All right, well, let's just show you the front page of The Guardian. Prime Minister still has big questions to answer over Hancock. Helena Kennedy was mentioning some of them. Let's go into a little more detail with our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. What are the questions that are being put by Labour about Matt Hancock to the Prime Minister?
Morning, Joe. Well, Labour are asking questions about how did Gina Coladangelo actually get appointed as a non-executive director to the Department of Health, and what was Matt Hancock's involvement in that process, and what was the status of their relationship at that point. But the thing Labour are really pushing today is this reporting over the weekend that at various points in the pandemic, Matt Hancock was using his private email, his Gmail account, to conduct government business. And so Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, has written to Simon Case, the chief civil servant, the cabinet secretary, and also to the Information Commissioner's office to ask whether that actually happened and whether that would be a breach of the Freedom of Information Act. And it means that official data would escape scrutiny. So those are some of the questions being asked by Labour. The question that is being asked in the Department of Health is how did that now infamous CCTV footage get leaked in the first place? And I think the questions being asked informally by ministers of their officials this morning in Whitehall is where are the cameras in and around my office?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Adam Fleming. Lots of questions to answer and being posed. Raphael, there has been some discussion that Kier Starmer, the Labour leader, should have landed a bigger blow over what has unfolded following Matt Hancock's resignation. Do you agree?
I have to admit, I was a little bit surprised that you didn't get an expression of the real fury early on. That I think it should have been pretty clear that the main thrust of the reaction was going to be that one that I think we've probably all seen, Trevor Phillips, the clip of him just really expressing personal anger, for people who've been through stuff in the pandemic and sacrificed things personally to see a minister breaking the rules. And I think that was something that you really needed an opposition leader to capture and land and say, yes, there are other issues and there's questions of propriety and cronyism, but really it's just disgraceful. It's such an insult to the public that this has happened, that he's broken the rules. Why is he still the Secretary of State? And I think that really gets to the heart of what a lot of Labour MPs find a bit lacking in Kier Starmer. They accept that he's a decent guy, that he's clever and articulate, but just the sense that he can't immediately forge an emotional connection with an audience and say, look, I am speaking for the people who feel frustrated and enraged by this government. And yes, I sense that he didn't get that right, or he didn't do it efficiently and pungently enough. And I think a lot of Labour MPs will, for other reasons as well, just be watching him over the weekend and think, yeah, he kind of gets it, but does he deliver it in the way that we need an opposition leader to do?
Well, Helena, do you agree? You were nodding through that. Has he not really captured the anger being felt by many people over this?
Well, I agree with Raphael. I thought that Trevor Phillips really did speak about this thing that many of us have experienced of not being able to go to funerals of people that we were close to and so on. I mean, terrible things that people up and down the country have suffered. And the interesting thing about Kier is that, of course, he totally empathises with all of that. But the difficulty he has is that he was brought up to, because his mother was so grievously ill all his life, that you've got to keep it all packed down. And I think that letting it all hang out has never been something that Kier's done easily, but it isn't about the fact that he doesn't feel those things very, very deeply. And we're just going to have to see if we can unwrap him a bit more. But he is an empathetic man. But I agree that what one wanted was that sense of outrage, which is something I felt over this whole business because of the way that I had personally been affected by. I mean, Trevor's daughter was someone who did work experience with me. I couldn't go to that funeral.
Right. Camilla, do you want to just explain a little bit more about the story that Helena is talking about in terms of Trevor Phillips? He was presenting yesterday and doing interviews around the fallout from Matt Hancock's resignation and the difference between the rules, the sort of one rule for them and one rule for us.
Yes, I mean, he was making the point very eloquently and actually emotionally, because he's lost his daughter, that he wasn't able to invite the 300 people or more that wanted to attend. And so that juxtaposition with everybody going around their private lives, not hugging granny and grandpa, keeping their distance, and actually the government controlling the minutiae of the things that we do behind closed doors. And then suddenly we had this situation on Saturday where there was a suggestion that we should be minding our own business and not interested in Matt Hancock's private life. You know, we consider the matter closed was almost the most tone-deaf, arrogant response to a public. And it wasn't like we were all frothing at the mouth, sort of braying for blood. It wasn't even a media mob mentality. The public just looked at it, as they did with Barnard Castle, and said, no, I'm sorry, he's not above the rules. And so, of course, we empathise with Phillips and his family. And he kind of represented the people that day. And I think Kier Starmer was found wanting. I mean, you don't want politicians to be so knee-jerk, they're out of the gates within the first minute of the photograph landing. But I think at some point on Friday afternoon, he may have wanted to have tweeted something or released a statement, but yet the silence was deafening.
Right. Would you agree with the bit about being tone-deaf and arrogant, Bim, in the response? You said, you know, family members of yours were outraged about it. So do you sympathise with what Camilla was talking about?
Of course I sympathise with the point Camilla made and with Trevor Phillips as well. And I think that this is, again, a reason why Matt Hancock had to go. And I'm just sad that he didn't realise that a little bit earlier. But he did, and he did the right thing. And I think that now the important thing is that we look forward and move on.
But the important thing there is about arrogance. You see, it's about that thing of feeling you're above the rules. And that's the thing that the public are feeling, is that there are a group of people in government who seem to be so entitled that they can do what they like. These are the people who insisted that they weren't for elites and so on, and yet they behave like an elite. People who do not feel the rules are for them, they can make the rules. The rest of us are the folk who have to trot along and behave like this and not see our grandchildren and so on.
Right. Well, we were also talking about Kier Starmer and his reaction. I just want to show you this headline in the Sunday Times. Hard left and Blairites circle Kier Starmer ahead of Batley and Spen by-election. This is on challenges from both the left and the right of the Labour Party if they lose the Batley and Spen by-election. How serious is this threat to Kier Starmer's leadership? Is there one?
Well, I have no doubt that if the by-election is lost, that there will be lots of rumbling about it. I hope he doesn't give in to it. I hope it doesn't happen. But I'm sure that there will be people who, because they've been waiting for an opportunity, there are people on both of those sort of, if you like, outer extremities who want to go after him. And it's not a sensible thing to be doing just now. And I just feel that, just hold on. Is my advice to people in Labour. But you can be sure there will be people. Look at the way in which George Galloway is running the campaign, which is to basically.
We have to be a little level, because, of course, he's one of many candidates, and we'll show all of the candidates because we're obviously in the final few days of the campaign. But I know where your point is going. Raphael, on the broader issue, if you look in the article, it suggests Dawn Butler, Labour MP, as a potential challenger, but she has ruled herself out. And Tony Blair is also mentioned as coming back. That does seem rather unlikely. So, I mean, is the threat really there?
Look, people are always complaining about Labour leaders, and there's always rumours and rumbles about a leadership contest or a challenge. The reality is the Labour Party very, very rarely gets rid of its incumbent leaders. What it tends to do is just sort of torment them and keep them in this kind of sadistic prison of sort of tolerable disloyalty where they can't exactly
Sounds very uncomfortable, yes.
Say, yeah, it is. It's pretty uncomfortable. And it sort of debilitates them and sort of bleeds their authority. And it happened to Ed Miliband. It happened to Jeremy Corbyn. You know, it happened to Tony Blair, really, in government almost. I mean, it does seem to be a thing that Labour Party does. You know, if it were the Conservative Party, they just look at someone who think, is this person actually going to be Prime Minister? Are they going to cut it? And very quickly, if the answer is no, they go, well, we better try someone else. And the problem that the Labour Party has at the moment is that the right of the party that's disappointed with Kier for the reasons we've slightly discussed is terrified that if he goes, it just will go back, swing back towards the sort of Corbynite wing of the party. I think the Corbynite wing of the party are actually quite happy with Kier sort of being a bit useless in incumbency for a bit longer, because that, the longer that goes on, the more it proves their point, as they see it, that actually, really we were even better off under Corbyn, whatever the right said, and to sort of build a challenge. So nothing will happen immediately, but you will just see this sort of slow, debilitating, as I say, this sort of seeping away of authority, unless Kier Starmer sort of demonstrates something that he hasn't yet demonstrated and just comes out and says, you know what, back me or sack me because I can't put up with this. That doesn't seem to be his style, but I think that moment will come, and it's probably up to him to decide whether he wants it to come sooner or later.
Camilla?
Well, I think that the trouble is about this issue with alternatives. There was some surprise expressed by Cummings and others, that Boris Johnson had become Prime Minister, but the alternative at the time was Jeremy Corbyn, and everyone decided that they didn't want that, or at least the majority did. Equally, I think with Starmer, there are people perhaps chomping at the bit to replace him, but nobody putting their neck above the parapet. And so for Labour voters, they're having to ask themselves, well, who might be better at this point? And equally, I think it's been troublesome for Labour, hasn't it, that they have naturally supported lockdown, and therefore they haven't been able to take that position of opposition for opposition's sake, because they actually largely support what the government's been doing.
Do you recognise, Helena, the torture chamber described there by Raphael in terms of Labour leaders?
Absolutely, and who would want to do it? No, I think that's true, and I hope that at some point very soon that Kier Starmer does say that, back me or sack me because I'm here to do something. I of course want to hear a much sort of clearer sense of where Labour is taking the party, but I do think that there is a problem, and Starmer's had this problem, which is, you're presented with a pandemic. You do not want to be just biting the ankles of the government party, while you want to be an effective opposition. So you're having to do two things, and you're having to be seen to be on the side of the safety and the health of the nation. And so it's a difficult one to run. You're driving in the middle of the road here. It's very, very difficult, and you're likely to end up with serious problems. I think he's tried to, with some dignity, to maintain a position which is to support the science and to support the health of the nation.
All right, we're going to move on. I'll just show, very, very briefly, Raphael.
I would just add also, look, it's an 80-seat Conservative majority. Even in the best circumstances, that doesn't get overthrown in one general election. So I think Labour is possibly slightly in denial about the scale of the electoral mountain they've got to climb under any leader. All
right, let's see the rundown of the candidates for that Batley and Spen by-election. We're showing it to you on your screens now. That is, of course, happening on Thursday. But we're going to move on and talk about schools, because there's been a significant increase in the number of children being sent home from school because of COVID-19, either because they have tested positive themselves or they've been instructed to self-isolate. Now, the figures from the Department of Education, I should say, up to the 17th of June was that 214,000 children had been sent home from school to self-isolate in England, with 9,000 children having tested positive with COVID. Let's talk about the impact that is happening with Graham Dow, the head teacher at Anchor's Home Academy in Blackpool. Graham, what has been the impact on your school?
Like many schools in the local area, we are waking up every morning wondering when the phone call is going to come to identify that there is a positive case in a classroom or in a larger group, and then having to make the decision of how many of those children to send home following an investigation. So just this morning, I've had to send a Year 6 bubble home, a class bubble home, because we had over the weekend notification that there were a number of lateral flow positive tests, and then this morning a positive PCR test.
Right, so so that's a whole year group. What impact is that having then on the ability to teach these kids?
Well, I mean, significant. I mean, during the lockdown period when we were doing remote learning, the children were getting very used to remote learning. They were accessing it very well. But of course, it's very difficult for them to be in a position at home when they feel, I suppose, motivated to access remote learning, even though we do everything we possibly can to do that. I think now we've moved into this sporadic, we might be in, we might not be in, we might be in, we might not be in. That's not generating the same kind of, I suppose, incentive for the children to engage in remote learning. I know that the teacher of the class this morning was straight on at 9 o'clock, had her Zoom registration group, the children, and she will find the ways to engage the children, but it must be immensely difficult for them. And I think worse than that, you know, on a Monday morning, if parents are receiving a message, I mean, we did try to warn them over the weekend multiple times so they could prepare, but on a Monday morning, if they're receiving a message to say that their 10-year-old child is going to have to isolate,
yes,
that has a huge impact on them as a family,
right?
Because then they have to consider work arrangements, etc.
Just to put it into some context in terms of the numbers in your area, there were 295 cases per 100,000 people in Blackpool in the last week we have data for. The average across England was 73 during that time. I mean, are you concerned that areas like yours, more heavily affected by outbreaks, will see their young people fall further behind?
Well, certainly I'd say in the last 5 to 6 weeks, we have seen a colossal number of schools that have had to revert to closing bubbles down. During the height of the pandemic, there was hardly any. There was a few, but hardly any. So we have seen a recent surge in the number of positive cases in primary and early teenage children. And I think without a doubt, that is going to mean at the end of a difficult year, when we are trying our best in schools to operate a catch-up curriculum that's going to bring the children back to where they are, if that's going to keep being punctuated by children being sent home, then it's going to have a massive impact on that. And then, of course, we've got a 6-week summer holiday coming up where children will once again be away from the learning routines.
Right. Well, Graham, thank you very much. Stay with us if you like to listen to the discussion. I mean, Bim, this can't go on, can it? All these children being sent home, whether they've been in close contact or not with someone who's tested positive.
No, it can't. And at each of the phases, when we've sort of released restrictions over the last few months, we've come up with new guidance in different workplaces, different environments, such as schools. I'm expecting that on the 19th of July, if we get to that point...
Although schools will have almost broken up by then, won't they?
Yes,
they have in Scotland.
I agree, but I think obviously looking to the next term, we've got to sort this out, because it is not a tenable situation. Everybody knows that. And I feel very, very deeply that the impact on our young people needs to be absolutely first and foremost. Has been, but needs to be strengthened even more as we work on the catch-up process as we emerge from this.
Right. I mean, Camilla, do you think it's just been too blunt an instrument?
Well, I'm in the situation where my eldest, she's 12, is upstairs now on Google Classroom because we got pinged last night that I think she'd been on a coach with a girl in a higher year who's tested positive. They went to an athletics match together, and therefore the whole of that coach and all of that year need to self-isolate now. And I suppose the impact really, the learning is okay because it's very good, the provision of online learning, but this week she's missing this Shakespeare exam that she had practiced for, she's missing sports day. She's missing some of the end of term activities, and we've had a whole year of this, haven't we, with kids missing out on these kind of moments that become cherished childhood memories and they can never be replaced. She's tested negative with lateral flow tests. I think she'll continue to. She's got no symptoms. And, you know, huge swathes of the school are now off because of this whole rule. So, yeah, I think it needs to change. We can't go into September now, both as parents and pupils, sort of facing the prospect of again having weeks out of the classroom.
Right. I mean, Helena, what do you think in terms of solutions, alternatives to sending whole year groups or big bubbles of children home? I mean, one of the options is, of course, vaccinating children. What's your view?
I think that we're going to end up having to look at the whole business of vaccinating children. I really do. I mean, just hearing Camilla's story about her daughter missing all those things that are so precious to school years and so on, and to the bonding and the building of relationships and all that stuff.
Because that's how children grow, isn't it?
That's how you grow, and that's how you. And so it's as much as the actual sort of of formal learning. So I really do think that we're going to have to start looking at the business of vaccination.
Right. I mean, Raphael, do you think people will get to a point, if they have already, say that it will be in schools to a certain extent, or is that not really acceptable or palatable?
I think we're just more generally now in this weird sort of in-between stage of the pandemic, where first of all the signal has been sent partly by government, but also from other sources, just the sense that it's kind of culturally over because the vaccine programme has been rolled out quite effectively, and then the tragic coincidence that also at the same time you get this Delta variant, which is more transmissible, and this sort of weird race against time between can enough people be vaccinated that this more transmissible version of the virus can be held at bay, and what that really points to is this question that everyone is going to be asking more and more over the coming months, which is what would it look like to sort of move the onus away from the government tells people exactly what they have to do and what all the rules are to we sort of know what basic good hygiene and public health practice is, and there's more autonomy either in the household or for the schools to set their own rules, and we live with the coronavirus the way we live with flu, for example, or other risks and hazards. And I obviously I don't know what the answer to that is in terms of vaccinating children. You defer to what the scientists say is safe. But ultimately, I do think we're not yet hearing enough. I think from government to say, okay, rather than saying we've set this date, this is when it's going to happen because people need to have their freedom. You'd like a much more sophisticated conversation that says, okay, we're entering a new phase of this. What's that going to look like? How are we going to manage that? I don't really get the impression that the Prime Minister's up for having that conversation, but it feels to me like a conversation that we really badly need to be having a little bit more prominently. Right.
Well, before I get Graham's response, Bim, do you agree with that?
I think when the decision's made around the 19th of July, and as I repeat, I hope that the decision will be that we remove all restrictions, or almost all of them.
Yeah, but does there need to be more of a conversation?
No, I'm saying, but at that moment, I think that a huge range of things will be discussed, like schools, workplaces, various other things. So I think that will probably be the key moment in the coming weeks where we do sort of crystallise those decisions and those discussions that we were mentioning.
Graham, do you have a preferred solution in terms of how to respond when we're in this sort of in-between stage?
Just before I answer that, one of my concerns about the talk about vaccination is that all of my staff in school are double vaccinated, every single one of them. And yet, if there is a positive case in a classroom, those staff have to be sent home. So if we go down the route where we vaccinate all children, and I would have concerns about that, we would still be in exactly the same situation if there was a positive case in the classroom. Because of the current guidelines, all of the children would still have to be sent home, because the argument is despite having a vaccination, you can still transfer the virus. So I think there needs to be a discussion around the vaccination. Personally, I was talking to my nephews in the RAF, and if there's a positive case in the department where he is, my understanding is that 2 days later they test immediately, PCR, and 2 to 3 days later they test again. Anybody that is then negative is then sent back. Now, to me, we need to be looking at that as a potential solution for schools. Because to just bluntly send home 90, 100 children for 10 days and have that impact on 100 families for 10 days, to me, is not the way forward. And if on the 19th of July we're going to say, OK, then all bets are off, then we're going to be in a situation in schools where this could potentially carry on for years. For years, we could have a case whereby, OK, a positive case, everybody has to be sent home. Just reflecting back on one of your the people were saying before, is that with flu, we don't send an entire class home if a child has flu. What we do is we ask parents to monitor those children, and if they have the shared symptoms, then to send them home. We need something like that. I'm no specialist in medical spoken, so I can't give the answer. But we need something that's going to stop this massive impact on children's education and more so their families.
Graham, thank you very much for joining us. Camilla, you posted something on Twitter, which we are going to put up now, last week. We must call out online hate when we see it, which is why I'm posting this death threat sent to my website this morning in the name of #Harry and Meghan fandom. Never be cowed by these abject hypocrites. Fight for the right to disagree agreeably. #Stop online hate. What was going on?
Well, I woke up to a death threat on Wednesday morning after I'd appeared on This Morning, making a comment about Meghan, talking about Archie being a voracious reader. She had said that he was he had a voracious appetite for books, but I paraphrased it. And apparently that was enough to incite hatred against me, my husband and my children. So I had to report that to the police. And what happened was I was trending on both sides of the Atlantic because the so-called Sussex squad had sort of whipped up this kind of #Camilla Tominey is a liar, but then to kind of initiate some sort of Twitter pile-on. But my point in tweeting it and calling it out was, I'm sure everyone on this panel, and even you, Joe, have been on the receiving end of this kind of vile abuse. And the point is, lots of people sort of try and show sympathy very kindly by saying, oh, it's a nightmare, isn't it? It must be a nightmare what you have to put up with. And my point on this is, no, we don't have to put up with any of this. The idea that just simply by doing our jobs and exercising a degree of scrutiny over the people that we report on, that we are in any way sort of racist or bigoted or open to abuse, I think is completely unacceptable. Women politicians get it in the neck, women journalists, male journalists, anyone in public life. There's a campaign which I think Marcus Rashford and others are doing in football, talking about Hope United rather than having pile on there about their performances. I mean, this online hate and the idea that a mob can rule on Twitter, I find completely unacceptable, and I think we need to stand up against it. Right, well, as you say, journalists, politicians, women in public life do get an awful lot of abuse. This in The Scotsman from Caroline Monaghan MP, Glasgow SNP politician, speaks of credible threat which sparked move to police safe house. Is it getting worse?
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely getting worse. It really is getting worse. And there's going to be an online, I mean, there's talk of it coming on, this online safety bill. And I really think it should be accelerated. I mean, we have to do something about this really sharpish because it has reached such a terrible point. And I have to say, the women get this particularly in a vicious way. I really think that it's something we have to get hold of. And I'm sorry that Camilla's gone through that because it is a poison. And I have to tell you that I don't do Twitter. And so I don't do Facebook. I've decided that I don't want that. My children tell me when people are saying awful things about me, as they undoubtedly will after this morning. But I say, don't tell me. I don't want to know because it is a poison and actually is very undermining of people. But it's undermining of kids at school as well.
Yeah, I mean, can legislation get a grip on this? Bim, because Helena mentions the draft online safety bill introduced or included by the government in the Queen's speech. All companies in scope will have a duty of care towards their users to get anything unacceptable offline. But is that really going to keep up with what's going on?
It may not, and that's why I think we're going to have to be much tougher than we have been. And I mean, we as a society, we've been over the last few years. I actually think that we need to, when it comes to the big tech platforms, we mentioned Twitter, but there are others. We need to be treating them much more toughly, much more strictly, and saying that if this stuff appears on your sites, then we're going to impose that responsibility, much more responsibility on you as the website, as the platform. And I think if we do that with the brains and ability they have to get rid of things.
How do you enforce it? That's the big issue. How do you enforce it?
But I think that what we do is we put a lot more pressure on them to get rid of this stuff and to make sure that this stuff does not appear on their platforms. And if we can do that, that will, I'm not saying that solves the whole problem, but I think that it will go some way as to at least making sure that the mainstream platforms are not consumed by this sort of hate-filled speech?
In terms of law, it's difficult. I mean, one of the things that I think we should be addressing is anonymity, because then you can't prosecute individuals who are, harassing and I mean, hounding in the most vicious way so many people, and they should be prosecuted. And that's one of the ways that you send a message to society. You do this is going to happen, and anonymity is not going to be respected if you're doing this to people, and you're going to end up before the courts, and there are consequences for it. But you need to have consequences for all the good talk in the world and conversations with the big tech companies. They are not adequately regulated.
I wasn't saying conversations. I was saying impose regulations on them.
And enforcement processes.
Of course.
I'm afraid we haven't got time. So sorry, Raphael. I wanted to go back to you before the end of the programme, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. But we will be back tomorrow morning again at 9:15. Please join me then. It's all because of the Wimbledon coverage, of course. But get up a bit earlier. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.